Alright, today I'm going to talk about global trade, and just to spice things up, I promise that we will talk about the following topics: Molotov cocktails, banana wars, and an Englishman incongruously named Ricardo. So previously I mentioned something called comparative advantage, but I realized that I probably didn't go in depth enough about it because a lot of you seem to think that comparative advantage was a pretty good argument for government involvement in trade, but it's exactly the opposite is true. The 19th century English economist David Ricardo did a lot of the most important work on this concept of comparative advantage, which sounds easy enough, simple enough when you first hear it, but is a little more complicated. In the first place, you have to distinguish comparative advantage from absolute advantage. All right, absolute advantage is the ability to produce something more efficiently than another country, quite simply. And the United States has an absolute advantage over most countries in most areas. If the entire global economy were just a contest to see who could produce a given item at the lowest cost and the best quality and in the least amount of time, then the United States would win hands down almost all of those contests. But the economy isn't that. The economy, the global economy, is about producing a large amount efficiently, many different goods, all the goods that people might want. If absolute advantage were our guide, then the United States should just produce everything that the United States needs, and that's it. We shouldn't import any goods at all. We should be entirely self-sufficient. But the law of comparative advantage tells us that that's not true, that even though we're better at making most things than almost every other country, we should still give up some of those things to those other countries and concentrate on the things that we have the lowest opportunity cost for. Let me give you sort of a concrete example. So in the United States, we used to have a large and productive textile industry. So, producing t-shirts and other things like that. Now, we could still do that, and we'd probably do it better than anyone else because we have such high-skilled workers in the United States. However, our workers are so high-skilled that it doesn't really make sense for us to be spending labor on making t-shirts when they could be doing more productive tasks. So our workers do more productive tasks, and we outsource those jobs to countries with relatively lower skilled workforces like China and other countries like that. So it's not a matter of cost in terms of dollars and cents, right? We could probably still produce those t-shirts more cheaply if we were doing it here. It's a matter of opportunity cost, which is hard to measure in dollars and cents. Now, the government isn't very good at figuring out opportunity costs because they can't know what every single person and every single business's best thing given up is, or what it is that they forego when they do something. They can take account for accounting costs, like how much does it cost to produce X, but they can't really figure out for an economy of 300 million people, they probably couldn't even figure out for an economy of 5,000 people, what everyone else's very best other option is. But you and companies are really good at that because you are you. You're in the position of being you. You know all the options that are available to you. So when we sort of leave the situation alone, a free market will find what you have a comparative advantage in, which isn't always what you think you're going to have a comparative advantage in. For a long time, we thought the United States had a comparative advantage in making cars, but it might turn out that we don't, and that we should sort of let the auto industry sort of decline, and other industries will take its place. Okay, so much for the law of comparative advantage. But the upshot of the law of comparative advantage is that it's always more efficient to freely trade rather than to have trade barriers. That doesn't always mean it's better, it just means it's more efficient. Okay, so why would you even have protectionism at all? And to find the answer to that, we're going to have to go back to mercantilism. Mercantilism is basically the idea that in order to become very rich, which means having lots of gold and silver, you need to export large amounts of manufactured goods in exchange for other countries' gold and silver. This belief led to a large amount of protection of domestic manufacturing industries in order to achieve that very purpose, to try to export a lot of goods to other countries in exchange for all their wealth, because at that time they considered gold and silver to be real wealth. So in other words, the idea behind mercantilism is that you want to have more exports than imports. Okay, you want to sell more goods to other countries than you're buying from them. In other words, you want to have a positive balance of trade. If you're exporting more than you're importing, that's called a trade surplus, whereas if the opposite is true, if you're importing more than you're exporting, you have a trade deficit. Now, a lot of economists think that having a big trade deficit is a bad thing, and the United States does and has for a while. That doesn't mean we don't export much. We're still very close to China, but second in exports in the entire world. It's just that we import a lot more than any other country as well. But we have to do a little bit of analysis. Sure, exporting less means those export industry jobs aren't here, but we're purchasing goods from other countries and sending dollars over to those countries. And where can those countries spend those dollars? Only here. Well, they're not importing goods from us in exchange, so what is happening to those dollars? Well, eventually those dollars are going to have to come back here, either in consumption, so we're going to be exporting goods in exchange for those dollars, or in investment. But for now, a lot of those dollars come back to us when countries that import from us purchase U.S. government bonds. So if you ever wondered why Japan, China, and Germany hold a lot of U.S. government bonds, that's why, because they export a lot of goods to us in exchange for American dollars, and they use those dollars to buy bonds. Okay, so I'll talk about reasons why you might want to protect, why you might want to engage in protectionism, even though we know it's less efficient. But first I'm going to talk about how you would engage in protectionism. And the first and most obvious one that most of you guys are aware of is tariffs. Okay, we put tariffs on things like steel, on cars, on motorcycles, on lots of different things, generally in order to help those industries in the United States. But a tax on imports is one way that we can do that. Another way that we can do that is through an import quota. So we don't just tax goods coming in from other countries, but in some cases we actually limit how much of a good we can import from another country, or businesses in the United States can import. So one of the goods that we do that with is sugar. So we actually have import quotas on sugar, so we can only import so much sugar before the rest of it has to be produced by American sugar producers. And then a third way that we can limit imports is through environmental or health regulations and standards. Sometimes those really are for people's health and safety, right? We don't want to import toys with lead paint in them, for example. But sometimes those standards are really not actually for safety purposes. They're really just to sort of prevent goods from specific countries from getting into the United States. So why would you want to engage in protectionism? Why would you want to erect barriers to global trade if you know that it's less efficient? Well, there are really three reasons, and each of the reasons sort of gets at the heart of why we call enacting trade barriers protectionism. We're protecting something in our country. Now, the first and probably the most familiar to you reason why you would protect is to protect jobs. All right, so jobs in the auto industry, jobs in the steel industry, jobs in the textile industry. If we prevent the importation of cars or steel, then everybody has to buy American cars, at least in the United States, and American steel. And so workers in those industries have a stable job. A second reason is to protect infant industries, and this was a lot of times the reason that was given at our nation's founding when we earned most of our federal revenues from tariffs. That we wanted to protect infant industries from, already developed industries, already developed companies in those industries and other countries. So there are actually countries that have tariffs designed to protect new companies. Like in India, they have their own car company called Tata Motors, believe it or not, that they have enacted large tariffs to try to protect from bigger, more established car companies like Toyota or Ford. A lot of times you'll hear this as a justification for subsidizing industries in the United States, like the solar industry, that is a fledgling industry, not because there are big companies in other countries that could crowd them out of the market, but because the technology might not exactly be there yet, but we're hoping it will be. And a third reason why you would do this is basically for national defense. There's a reason why so many countries protect their agriculture industries, especially things like cotton or just basic foodstuffs, because in the event of war, they don't want to get stuck with having no domestic source of production for those things. And that's why we give preferential contracts to American companies for defense industries. So people like Boeing or Lockheed Martin, companies like that are American companies that we want to be strong in case we end up having to go to war with somebody. We don't want to have to depend on another country for manufacturing and designing jets and tanks and things like that. So national defense is a third reason why you would engage in protectionism. All right, so protectionism sounds like a really good thing, right? Protect our jobs, protect our country, make sure that we have strong industries in certain areas. But there are costs, right? It is a trade-off. First of all, we're giving up efficiency. That's the first thing. But secondly, you'll remember hopefully that part of supply, that supply curve that slopes upward because of the law of supply, depends on global supply, right? So if we make it more difficult to import certain goods, that means the supply is going to go down at every price. That means the curve is going to move to the left. And the equilibrium price will, you guessed it, go up. So tariffs cause prices to go up for consumers. Tariffs and import quotas also have a tendency to tick other countries off who want to import stuff into the United States or export stuff to the United States. And sometimes countries will get involved in what are called trade wars, which is just an escalating series of tariffs, in retaliation for other tariffs that really just cause prices to go up for everybody. So we've had trade wars over things like steak, bananas, stuff like that. No joke. Now, two organizations that I want you guys to be familiar with that have a lot to do with global trade are the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund. The World Trade Organization was established after World War II in order to try to reduce trade barriers around the world and promote free global trade. And one of the things that they do is they basically mediate trade disputes and try to advocate for the lowering of trade barriers. So these guys actually have some power to judge trade disputes between countries, but nobody elected them. And that really makes them the source or the target of a lot of conspiracy theories. And every time they have like a conference somewhere, like they did in Vancouver and in Seattle in 1999, then you'll get lots of anarchist protesters hurling Molotov cocktails and basically not being very happy about the whole situation. The IMF was also established right after World War II, in part to try to stabilize currency exchanges to promote global trade and make it easier to trade. But nowadays, mostly what they do is, countries that owe a lot of money, not countries like the United States because we're, still the richest country in the world, but countries that maybe aren't as wealthy, aren't as well developed, they'll go to those countries, they'll try to financially help them, in exchange for making those countries adopt programs that will increase their exports, which for a while was a very popular option until they did it in Argentina, and Argentina defaulted on all their government debt. So they also can be controversial, but they're very important sort of in this area of world trade. Now this is an especially important debate, this whole world trade thing in Detroit, because we're so heavy on manufacturing and so heavy on union jobs, and of course unions don't like global free trade because, they want to protect auto industry jobs and other industries' jobs. And so I'll leave you to think about that, whether we should try to protect those jobs or whether we should, have free global trade, more efficient, lower prices, or, what the costs and benefits of those things are.